Sit back, relax, and let your mind settle into the dim glow of a world that existed long before the crowded piazzas and sun-washed streets of Italy as you know it today. Because the story of medieval Italy does not begin with triumph or beauty, but with a quiet shadow stretching across a fractured land. Picture the Italian peninsula around the fall of Rome hills, wrapped in silence. Abandoned roads eroding under wind and rain, and ancient statues staring blankly at a future no one could yet imagine. Some historians describe this moment as a long exhale after centuries of empire, while others suggest it was more like a subtle tremor before a deep, uncertain night. In this world, power did not vanish. It simply scattered. Old Roman walls still stood, but their meaning had changed. Where senators once debated, local warlords now whispered. Where legions once marched, small bands of survivors moved cautiously across valleys swept by mist. And in the middle of it all, Italy became a crossroads of memory and ambition, a place caught between what had been and what might someday rise again. As you drift further into this story, imagine the textures of the era around you. Rough wool cloaks brushing against cold stone floors, distant church bells echoing through fog-covered towns, the faint smell of burning olive oil mixing with the dampness of early medieval forests. This was a land where every footstep felt like it carried the weight of the past, where villagers clung to the remnants of Roman customs even as new influences pressed in from the north and east. Some chroniclers wrote that Italy during this time felt suspended between worlds, and perhaps they were right. The Lombards were arriving, shaping new kingdoms atop old ruins. The Byzantines still held fragments of the peninsula, clinging to their fading empire. And the church, quiet but rising, began threading its influence through every hilltop, every village, every whispered prayer at dusk. Nothing was settled. Everything was shifting. And beneath these shifting layers grew an atmosphere of tension, curiosity, and quiet endurance. This is the Italy you're stepping into, a place not yet defined by glorious Renaissance cities or powerful maritime republics, but by uncertainty, resilience, and the strange beauty of a world learning to rebuild itself. So as we begin this long journey through the entire history of medieval Italy, let this lingering question guide you. In a land so haunted by its past, how does a new world begin to take shape? Next, we move deeper into the shifting landscape of early medieval Italy, where a new rhythm begins to echo across the valleys and forests, the steady, deliberate footstep of the Lombards. Imagine them entering the peninsula not as a sudden storm, but as a long, rolling wave, families and warriors traveling together beneath heavy skies. Their arrival, described by some chroniclers as both unsettling and strangely orderly. They came from the north, carrying with them traditions carved from colder lands. And as they settled into Italy's gentler climates, the peninsula itself seemed to inhale sharply, adjusting to a presence both foreign and transformative. Some researchers believe the Lombards were far more sophisticated than their first impression suggests. Others claim they ruled with rough pragmatism, shaping Italy through necessity rather than vision. But either way, their mark would be unmistakable. Picture the subtle transformation in the countryside, wooden halls rising where Roman villas once stood, new laws spoken in crisp, unfamiliar cadences, marketplaces blending the leftovers of Rome with the customs of newcomers. You might hear the clang of their metalwork, softer and less refined than Roman craft, but sturdy, functional, and meant to endure. The Lombard identity wove itself into Italy like a new thread pulled through old fabrics, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, always shifting the texture of daily life. Towns such as Pavia grew into centers of their rule, places where kings debated their next steps under torchlight, and where scribes tried to capture the evolving world on fragile parchment. Some wrote in Latin, others in a developing Italian, and between the two languages lay a quiet struggle for the peninsula's future voice. Meanwhile, the church watched carefully. Bishops and monks recorded the era with a mix of suspicion and cautious respect, noting how these newcomers adopted certain Christian customs while reshaping others to fit their own traditions. It created an atmosphere of subtle tension, a peninsula, balancing between old Roman memory and rising Lombard identity, between imperial echoes and tribal determination. And yet, despite these layers of uncertainty, life continued with a kind of calm inevitability. Farms expanded, trade routes flickered back to life, families adapted. Italy was no longer Rome, but it was becoming something new, something forged in the meeting of cultures. As you settle deeper into the quiet mystery of this transformation, let a single question hover gently over your thoughts. In a land where nothing remains stable for long, how long could the Lombard world endure before the next great force arrived to reshape Italy once more? From one mystery to the next, we now drift toward the soft but steady heartbeat that began pulsing through medieval Italy as the Lombard world expanded. The quiet rise of the Christian Church, not through sudden conquest or sweeping decrees, but through something more subtle, almost instinctive presence. Imagine traveling through Italy during this time and noticing how the smallest, most isolated villages seemed anchored by a single stone building with a wooden cross. How weary travelers stopped not at grand Roman forums, but at humble monasteries offering bread, shelter, and whispered prayers. Some scholars argue that the church stepped into the vacuum left by Rome, filling it with structure and continuity. Others suggest it used the uncertainty of the age to strengthen its influence. But no matter the interpretation, one thing is clear. The church became the quiet spine of medieval Italy. Picture monks moving through cool cloisters lit by flickering candles, their bare feet brushing against cold tile, their voices rising in slow, rhythmic chants that echoed through stone corridors. In scriptoria, scribes hunched over parchment, slowly copying texts that would otherwise have vanished into the fog of time. Each stroke of ink was an act of preservation, each illuminated page a small defiance against the chaos of the outside world. Meanwhile, bishops acted as mediators, advisors, and sometimes power brokers, navigating alliances with Lombard rulers, Byzantine officials, and local aristocrats. Their influence was soft but persistent, like water carving stone over generations. The Papacy in Rome, though not yet the towering authority it would become, was beginning to reclaim a sense of direction and purpose. Some accounts describe early medieval popes walking through streets still lined with broken statues, blessing a city that felt half ghost, half promise. Others suggest that the papacy's growing authority came from its ability to speak to every layer of society, from noble families seeking legitimacy to peasants in remote valleys searching for protection and meaning. And through all of this, Christianity reshaped the emotional landscape of Italy. Bells called people to prayer at dawn and dusk, marking the passing of time in a world where old Roman calendars had faded. Festivals blended ancient ritual with new faith. Fear of uncertainty slowly gave way to a different kind of order centered not on emperors or generals, but on faith, ritual, and the idea of a world governed by divine balance. As you let this atmosphere settle around you, a gentle question remains. in a land guided increasingly by the Church's quiet strength. What new power would rise next to challenge or reshape its influence? Next we move to the southern edges of the peninsula, where another presence lingered like a distant echo, the Byzantine Empire, the last shimmering fragment of Rome that refused to fully fade. Imagine the southern Italian coastlines at dawn, waves rolling gently against harbors built centuries earlier, the air thick with salt and the faint aroma of foreign spices. Here, the world felt different from the Lombard-dominated north. Greek words drifted through marketplaces, mosaics glimmered in pale morning light, and imperial officials still carried themselves with the polished confidence of a civilization that believed it had outlasted chaos. Some historians say the Byzantine presence in Italy was like a ghost, visible, influential, yet never fully alive in the way it once had been. Others argue it was a deliberate foothold, a calculated attempt to keep the memory of Roman authority breathing through the corridors of cities like Ravenna and Bari. Either way, the effect was unmistakable. The South became a world suspended between two realities, where the remnants of ancient Rome met the ambitions of medieval Europe. Picture the texture of life there, silk garments brushing past rough wool tunics, the metallic sound of Greek hymns mixing with Latin prayers, merchants offering Eastern perfumes beside farmers selling local olives. Administration followed Byzantine patterns, complex, layered, sometimes bewildering, yet undeniably stable. Soldiers wearing lamella armor patrolled narrow streets, while tax collectors moved from house to house with scrolls written in the elegant curves of Greek script. And in the grand churches, light poured through colored glass onto marble floors that had survived centuries of empires rising and collapsing. Yet beneath this fragile sense of continuity, tension simmered. Lombard dukes eyed Byzantine land with eager ambition. The Papacy watched with a mix of hope and mistrust, unsure whether the Eastern Empire would protect Rome or seek to dominate it. Ordinary Italians lived between these shifting forces, adapting as they always had, trading when possible, praying when uncertain, surviving through every change. Some chroniclers claimed the Byzantines were out of place here, holding on to territory they no longer had the strength to defend. Others suggested that their presence kept Italy connected to a wider world, one stretching from the Mediterranean to Constantinople, from ancient memory to living empire. And in this strange mix of cultures, power, and quiet endurance, the South grew into a region of layered identities, each competing to define its future. As you drift deeper into this landscape, let a new question rise softly within you. In a peninsula divided between Lombard ambition and Byzantine resilience, which force would ultimately guide Italy into the next chapter of its medieval story? As we move northward, we enter the world of the Papacy, a force as spiritual as it was political, whose shadows stretched over every corner of medieval Italy, shaping destinies in ways both visible and unseen. Picture Rome in the 13th century, the city alive with the echo of prayers, the clang of construction, and the whispers of intrigue that swirled through narrow streets and grand basilicas alike. Pope Innocent IV, a man trained in law and administration, had learned to wield more than just spiritual authority. He had mastered the subtle arts of diplomacy, legal argument, and the orchestration of opposition. Some scholars suggest that his exile from Rome did not weaken him, but instead created a strategic advantage. A papal court established beyond the reach of Emperor Frederick II, where ideas could flourish, alliances be formed, and opposition be carefully cultivated. The Council of Lyon in 1245 marked a pivotal moment in this struggle. A formal, legal assertion that the papacy held supremacy even over emperors, capable of judging, deposing, and directing the fate of rulers who threatened the church's interests. Imagine the tension in that hall. Bishops, abbots, and secular rulers gathered under the shadow of doctrine. Inked documents laying out arguments that blended canonical law with echoes of classical precedent. Outside, the world waited, armies stirred, and propaganda began to ripple through towns and countrysides, shaping loyalties in subtle, almost invisible ways. Frederick's forces, disciplined and professionally led, confronted resistance not just in battlefields but in hearts and minds influenced by papal sanctions, excommunications, and the careful orchestration of alliances. From one city to the next, Italy became a chessboard of power, where ecclesiastical and secular ambitions intersected, collided, and sometimes intertwined. The military campaigns that followed Frederick's deposition revealed both the empire's strengths and vulnerabilities. As local populations shifted, loyalties faltered, and new commanders emerged under papal sponsorship. Some historians see this as the beginning of a pattern that would define Italian politics for centuries. Power contested through a mix of law, warfare, and influence, with neither side ever entirely dominant. Others emphasize the profound consequences of papal strategy, noting how it reshaped dynasties, destabilized territories, and created opportunities for local strongmen to rise. And as we stand in the aftermath of these struggles, the question lingers: how much of Italy's medieval identity was forged by spiritual authority, and how much by the intricate dance of political survival that the papacy had mastered so quietly, so effectively, yet so dangerously? Next, we move to the rise and fall of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, a line of emperors whose ambition and brilliance would be matched only by the relentless opposition they faced from the papacy and Italian powers alike. Picture Frederick II, often called Stupimundi, the wonder of the world, a man whose intellect, multilingual mastery, and fascination with science and law made him both feared and admired across Europe. His reign was a delicate balancing act, stretching from the icy heights of Germany to the sun-baked plains of southern Italy, threading through the treacherous politics of the Holy Roman Empire and the fractious communes of the Italian peninsula. Yet, despite his tactical genius, Frederick's policies sparked an unrelenting campaign of resistance from ecclesiastical authorities who viewed his innovations and independence as existential threats to church supremacy. Some researchers suggest that his repeated excommunications and the formal deposition at Lyon were as much about asserting spiritual authority as they were about real politica, warning to any ruler who might challenge Rome. The wars that followed were brutal and protracted, with professional imperial armies clashing against papally sponsored forces across fortified cities, hilltop strongholds, and contested valleys. Imagine the sound of battering rams, the shouts of mercenaries, and the smoke rising over towns caught between allegiance and survival. Frederick's death in 1250 left a power vacuum, and his son, Conrad IV, struggled to maintain control over Italian territories, his efforts constantly undermined by coordinated papal opposition, rebellious cities, and foreign interventions seeking their own gains. The young emperor's untimely death in 1254 marked the collapse of Hohenstaufen authority, leaving the dynasty's legacy in ruins and opening the door for papal dominance in southern Italy. Yet even in defeat, the Hohenstaufen impact endured, their innovations in administration, law and military organization left an imprint on European governance, and the spectacle of their downfall illustrated the limits of imperial power in the face of coordinated ecclesiastical resistance. Some historians argue that this era planted the seeds for the fragmentation of Italy into competing powers, while others suggest it demonstrated the strategic brilliance of the papacy in turning temporal authority into a tool for long-term influence. And as we trace these events, the lingering question emerges: could any dynasty truly unify Italy under imperial authority? Or was the peninsula destined to remain a theatre of constant intrigue, shifting loyalties, and the subtle triumphs of unseen powers that shaped history from the shadows? From the ashes of imperial collapse, the Italian landscape transformed into a patchwork of seigneurial states. Small territories ruled by ambitious families who had mastered the delicate balance between power, legitimacy, and survival. Picture northern and central Italy, a maze of narrow streets, fortified palaces, and bustling markets, where the once communal governance of cities like Milan, Verona, and Ferrara had slowly ceded real authority to individuals capable of consolidating military, administrative, and financial control. The Viscanti family in Milan exemplifies this transformation, a dynasty that rose from temporary command into permanent dominance through strategic marriages, accumulation of ecclesiastical offices, and military prowess. Imagine the ceremonial splendor masking the quiet concentration of power behind closed doors. Councils that seemed public but were carefully orchestrated to serve a single family's ambition. Across the region, the Scaligari family in Verona and the Este family in Ferrara demonstrated how geography, commerce, and military strategy could be leveraged to create enduring regional power bases. Researchers note that these families exploited the weaknesses of communal governance factionalism, inconsistent taxation, and the inability to maintain sustained military forces to transform emergency authority into hereditary lordship, all while maintaining the appearance of republican legitimacy. Professional administrators and mercenary armies became the backbone of this new order, creating bureaucratic systems and military structures that outperformed the fragmented communes they replaced. The territories under seigneurial rule became laboratories of innovation, where taxation, legal frameworks, and urban administration were refined under the watchful eye of families whose survival depended on competence as much as cunning. Cultural patronage was another tool in this arsenal, with palaces, libraries, and courts serving as both symbols of wealth and instruments of soft power, attracting scholars, artists, and architects whose works projected prestige far beyond city walls. Yet, beneath the opulence lay a precarious reality. Each city-state was vulnerable to rival families. External powers and internal dissent and alliances were as fleeting as the fortunes of those who brokered them. As Italian cities shifted from communal assemblies to dynastic control, the political landscape became both more stable and more volatile, a paradox that defined centuries of Italian history. And as we look across these streets and palaces, one question lingers in the shadows. In a land of rising strongmen and fragmented authority, could any power, ecclesiastical, imperial, or civic, truly dominate the ever-shifting chessboard of medieval Italy? As the Italian landscape became a mosaic of seigneurial states, the art of war evolved alongside political power, shaping the very fate of cities and dynasties. Imagine the clamor of armored men, the scent of smoke and iron, and the rhythmic pounding of siege engines against thick stone walls, reverberating through narrow streets and open fields. Families like the Visconti in Milan, the Scaligari in Verona, and the Este in Ferrara developed professional armies, employing mercenary companies whose loyalty could be purchased but whose skill was unmatched. These forces brought not only brute strength, but tactical innovations that transformed medieval warfare. Siegecraft, once a slow and often ineffective ordeal, became a precise science, combining engineering ingenuity with psychological strategy. Towers and battlements were reinforced to withstand battering rams and early artillery, while coordinated assaults involved both deception and overwhelming force, exploiting weaknesses in even the most formidable fortifications. Archers, crossbowmen, and early cannon units reshaped the battlefield, forcing city leaders to rethink both defense and diplomacy, as failure meant destruction or subjugation. Northern Italy's rivers, bridges, and plains were not just landscapes, but instruments of strategy used to control trade routes, block reinforcements, and starve rival cities into submission. Historians suggest that these innovations were often learned from observing both imperial campaigns and papal expeditions, creating a hybrid form of military science uniquely adapted to Italy's dense urban environments. The Visconti, for example, systematically expanded Milanese territory by combining calculated diplomacy with precise military pressure, striking when rivals were weakest and fortifying positions that would serve as bases for future campaigns. Meanwhile, the Scaligari's control of Verona and its surrounding territories demonstrated the symbiosis of strategic location and military preparation, turning a city into a fortress and a center of cultural and political influence. Even the smaller Este territories leveraged their waterways and agricultural hinterlands to finance armies capable of both defense and conquest, proving that geography and commerce could be as decisive as raw military might. Yet with every innovation, the stakes grew higher. Siege warfare devastated urban populations, tested loyalties, and reshaped economies, forcing rulers to balance ambition with pragmatism. And as these families perfected the art of war, one can't help but wonder, did the relentless pursuit of military supremacy sow the seeds of Italy's enduring instability? Or was it the very crucible that forged the Renaissance's extraordinary political and cultural dynamism, as armies clashed and cities fortified themselves against rivals? The rulers of seigneurial states understood that military might alone could not secure lasting power. And so the art of governance evolved in parallel with the art of war, a quiet, meticulous, and often invisible force that shaped everyday life across northern and central Italy. The Visconti in Milan, the Scaligari in Verona, and the Este in Ferrara exemplified a sophisticated understanding of administration, transforming what were once fragile communal institutions into resilient, centralized bureaucracies that could manage taxation, maintain professional armies, and adjudicate disputes efficiently while projecting authority across complex and diverse territories. They retained the ceremonial trappings of the old communes' assemblies, councils, and public rituals, yet the real power increasingly resided in private councils staffed by trained administrators, often drawn from beyond the city itself, whose loyalty was to the ruler rather than the factional politics that had previously fractured governance. These professional bureaucrats compiled records, managed revenues, and coordinated military logistics, ensuring that armies were funded, supplied, and deployed with precision. Taxation systems became increasingly comprehensive, stretching from trade tariffs to agricultural levies, ensuring the rulers could finance not only war but also public works, fortifications, and the lavish patronage that enhanced their prestige and cultural influence. Strategic marriage alliances, control over key ecclesiastical positions, and careful manipulation of factional politics enabled seigneurial families to consolidate power without provoking widespread revolt. A delicate dance of coercion and legitimacy that few outsiders fully understood. Some researchers suggest that these innovations allowed the seigneurial rulers to transform ephemeral military commands or emergency magistracies into durable dynastic authority, effectively bypassing the traditional communal mechanisms that had dominated Italian politics for centuries. Yet, with all their sophistication, these states were fragile, constantly balancing the pressures of internal dissent, economic fluctuation, and the ever-present threat of rival cities or foreign intervention. The expansionist ambitions of families like the Viscanti and the Scaligari were not just military endeavors. They were exercises in governance, testing whether a ruler could administer newly acquired territories as effectively as he conquered them, and whether the people under his control would accept new forms of authority without rebellion. From one city to the next, from one province to the next. These administrative experiments would lay the groundwork for later Renaissance statecraft, demonstrating the power of centralized governance while highlighting the delicate interplay between authority, legitimacy, and human ambition. And yet, as power became concentrated in the hands of a few, one must ask how sustainable were these innovations, and what would happen when the ambitions of rulers outstripped the capacity of their institutions to contain them. As seigneurial states solidified their rule, it became clear that power was measured not only in law and administration, but also in the mastery of war. And nowhere was this more evident than in the armies of northern Italy, where innovation and professionalism transformed medieval combat into a science of strategy, logistics, and sustained pressure. Gone were the days when citizen militias or hastily raised levies could determine the fate of a city. Now, families like the Visconti and Scaligari relied on professional mercenary companies, well paid and disciplined, whose loyalty was secured through contracts, regular pay, and promises of plunder, creating an entirely new military ecosystem that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single commune. These mercenaries, often skilled in sea, cavalry maneuvers, and artillery operation, allowed rulers to wage campaigns with precision, combining traditional feudal levies with cutting-edge technologies like counterweight trebuchet, reinforced siege towers, and early cannon prototypes, all coordinated through carefully organized command structures. Cities that had once relied on walls and citizen defense were forced to adapt, rebuilding fortifications to withstand prolonged artillery, bombardments, and incorporating angled bastions and layered gates to slow the advance of professional armies. The siege of Padua in 1388 AD by Visconti forces illustrates this transformation. Not merely a clash of swords and banners, it was a meticulously planned operation, with coordinated bombardments, supply lines, and engineering works designed to methodically wear down resistance, demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that would redefine Italian warfare for decades. Some historians suggest that the reliance on mercenaries brought new challenges, creating dependencies on foreign troops whose loyalty could shift with fortune, and exposing cities to the risk of internal unrest if funding faltered. Others proposed that these military innovations were not only about conquest, but about deterrence, signaling to rival states that any challenge would meet a coordinated, disciplined, and technologically advanced response. The professionalization of war also had profound societal implications, as the presence of trained soldiers, organized campaigns, and extended sieges disrupted daily life, commerce, and agriculture, embedding the reality of organized conflict into the rhythm of Italian urban existence. From one battlefield to the next, from the Alpine foothills to the Venetian plains, the evolution of military power intertwined inexorably with governance, culture, and ambition, reminding us that in medieval Italy, the edge of a sword and the stroke of a pen were equally potent instruments of authority. And yet, for all this power, one wonders how long could such armies remain loyal, and what unseen fissures might emerge when ambition and fortune collided. As the seigneurial families cemented their dominance across Italian cities, their ambitions extended far beyond walls and armies, spilling into the realm of culture and artistic expression, transforming urban landscapes into canvases of power and prestige. The courts of the Visconti and Este families became laboratories of creativity where wealth, politics, and taste intersected, each commission carefully calculated to display both authority and refinement. Palaces were constructed not merely for residence, but as grand statements of permanence, with facades adorned in intricate stonework, frescoed halls narrating dynastic triumphs, and chapels that combined spiritual devotion with ostentatious display. Some researchers suggest that the patronage of poets, painters, and musicians was intended as more than aesthetic indulgence. It functioned as a subtle form of political communication, signaling sophistication and moral legitimacy to rival factions and foreign observers alike. In Ferrara, the Este court commissioned illuminated manuscripts that preserved classical knowledge, while celebrating contemporary achievements, blending Latin scholarship with vernacular innovation in a manner that reflected the unique intellectual climate of northern Italy. Meanwhile, Giotto's revolutionary frescoes in Padua and other urban centers broke from the rigid stylizations of earlier medieval art, introducing perspective, realistic human emotion, and narrative cohesion, capturing both the grandeur of sacred stories and the intimate struggles of the human condition, allowing observers to witness a divine drama rendered with startling immediacy. Some argue that such artistic endeavors were also instruments of social control, reinforcing the prestige of ruling families by embedding their likenesses, symbols, and achievements into the visual memory of the city itself, ensuring that power was both seen and remembered. Architectural innovations, from the soaring vaults of Florence's cathedrals to the fortified elegance of Scaligari palaces, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, while providing the urban population with spaces that inspired awe, devotion, and loyalty. The subtle interplay of cultural patronage, political messaging, and social influence created an ecosystem in which art became inseparable from governance, and beauty served ambition as much as devotion. Yet, despite the brilliance of these courts, questions lingered how much of this cultural flowering was genuine intellectual curiosity, and how much a meticulously orchestrated spectacle to solidify dominance, as Italy's cities gleamed with new creativity. The stage was quietly set for the coming explosion of ideas and innovation that would define an era, leaving historians to ponder the delicate balance between patronage, power, and the human impulse for legacy. By the 14th century, the papacy had transformed from a primarily spiritual authority into a formidable temporal power, tasked not only with guiding the souls of Europe, but also with administering extensive territories across central Italy, a responsibility that would test the limits of ecclesiastical governance. The Avignon papacy, beginning with Clement V's relocation in 1309 highlighted the precarious position of the Pope as a political actor, balancing spiritual leadership with the practical necessities of ruling. Land and people who often saw papal authority as distant, foreign, or coercive. French cardinals and administrators were installed to manage Italian territories, their presence creating both administrative efficiency and local resentment, as communities accustomed to semi-autonomous governance bristled at what felt like occupation. The taxation systems implemented to support the lavish court at Avignon were rigorous, often aggressive, and funded military campaigns, construction projects, and extravagant displays of wealth, raising questions about the compatibility of spiritual mission with worldly power. Papal military endeavors, such as Cardinal Alborno's reconquest campaigns in the 1350s and 1360s, demonstrated the capacity for organized, strategic use of mercenary forces, siege technologies, and coordinated administration. Yet these campaigns also highlighted the moral ambiguities of a church engaging in war, as armies clashed with local communes and rebel strongmen, leaving devastation in their wake. Fortresses, city walls, and administrative hubs were built and rebuilt, standing as imposing symbols of ecclesiastical might, yet drawing criticism from reform-minded clergy who questioned whether the church had strayed too far into temporal affairs. The intricate balancing act required to govern diverse populations with different traditions, languages, and loyalties revealed the fragility of papal power when exercised outside purely spiritual realms. Scholars debate whether these challenges ultimately strengthened or weakened the church. Some suggest that the papacy's administrative innovations provided models for later statecraft, while others argue they eroded moral authority by entangling the church in the same struggles that had long defined secular rule. The relocation to Avignon created a cultural and political shift, aligning the papacy more closely with French interests, yet leaving central Italy vulnerable to seigneurial expansion and communal assertiveness. As the 14th century progressed, the Church's struggle to maintain authority over temporal matters foreshadowed future crises, where spiritual legitimacy would collide with the pragmatics of power, setting the stage for conflicts and political fragmentation that would shape the Italian peninsula for generations. And so, as the popes navigated these treacherous waters, one must ask, could spiritual authority ever truly command temporal obedience? Or was the papacy's temporal empire destined to be as unstable as the human ambitions it sought to contain? The year 1378 AD marked the beginning of a crisis that would plunge Europe into confusion and uncertainty, the Great Western Schism. It was a period when the authority of the Pope, once unchallenged and absolute in the eyes of Christendom, became fragmented, with rival pontiffs claiming legitimacy from Rome and Avignon, each demanding the allegiance of rulers, nobles, and cities. In Italy, this schism reverberated with particularly dramatic consequences, as seigneurial families, communal governments, and local potentates were forced to navigate shifting loyalties, weighing the political and economic advantages of supporting one papal claimant over another. Venice, Florence, Milan, and smaller city-states suddenly found that allegiance to a pope was not just a matter of piety, but of survival, opportunity, and influence, as papal armies and mercenary companies intervened in local disputes, further complicating the already fractured political landscape. The schism demonstrated the degree to which spiritual authority had become intertwined with military power, diplomacy, and territorial ambition. Armies marched in the Pope's name, fortresses were seized, and cities faced sieges where cannon fire and battering rams bore witness to the harsh realities of medieval politics under the guise of religious legitimacy. Observers of the time noted the irony. holy men wielding swords and commanding soldiers, negotiating with nobles as though they were secular princes, and yet claiming divine sanction for their actions. Some historians suggest that the schism accelerated the decline of communal governance, as seigneurial families exploited papal divisions to consolidate power, forging alliances with one faction or another, while others argue that it revealed the inherent limitations of ecclesiastical authority when confronted by the ambitions of the powerful and practical realities of territorial administration. Throughout the Italian peninsula, local communities had to reconcile religious obligation with political pragmatism, often choosing survival over strict adherence to spiritual loyalty, and in doing so, they reshaped the balance of power in ways that would resonate for decades. The schism also underscored the vulnerability of centralized spiritual authority, with competing popes in distant cities. Communication slowed, edicts conflicted, and legitimacy became a matter of perception rather than certainty. Merchants, scholars, and artists observed and recorded these tensions, embedding the experience of divided authority into the cultural memory of Italy. As factions maneuvered for advantage, it became clear that the papacy's influence was no longer unassailable, and that the political vacuum created by internal religious strife would be filled by secular ambition, local strongmen, and ambitious communes. And so, as Europe grappled with a church divided against itself, one must wonder, in a world where swords often outweighed sanctity, could spiritual authority survive when tested by the relentless currents of human ambition and political intrigue? As the turmoil of the Great Western Schism spread across Italy, one city stood as a remarkable exception: Piona, maritime republic whose blend of commercial ingenuity and political pragmatism allowed it to thrive amidst the chaos. Venice, unlike seigneurial states, where power concentrated in the hands of ambitious families, Venice had built a system of governance rooted in collective aristocratic councils, merchant networks, and carefully balanced institutions that preserved both civic stability and economic prosperity. By the early 15th century, the city-state looked beyond its lagoon and toward the fertile plains and strategic trade routes of northern Italy, where Padua, Vicenza, and other mainland cities offered both resources and influence for those daring enough to claim them. In 1405 AD, Venice launched a calculated expansion into the Veneto, beginning with the conquest of Padua, a city long marked by factional disputes and internal weakness. The Venetians approached these campaigns not as purely military conquests, but as complex operations combining diplomacy, economic leverage, and strategic alliances. Venetian governors, often drawn from the city's noble families, were appointed to administer newly acquired territories, creating a network of loyal administrators capable of maintaining order, while respecting local customs and commercial practices. This approach contrasted sharply with the autocratic tendencies of seigneurial states, where authority was often enforced by sheer force and personal ambition. Venice's military innovations also reflected the city's dual identity as a maritime and terrestrial power. Galleys patrolled rivers and canals, while artillery-equipped armies besieged city walls with precision and coordination. Each victory strengthened not only Venice's territorial control, but also its commercial dominance, as rivers, roads, and ports fell under the careful supervision of a state that understood the inseparable link between trade and security. Cultural life thrived alongside expansion, with the Republic's wealth funding monumental architecture, artistic commissions, and public works that projected power while fostering civic pride. Yet even in Venice, this growth was not without tension. As the Republic stretched its influence over the mainland, The balance between autonomy for local communities and central oversight required constant negotiation, and the threat of rebellion or external intervention loomed persistently. Some scholars argue that Venice's success lay in its adaptability, the ability to blend commercial acumen with military prowess, political savvy, and cultural investment, creating a model of republican resilience that differed fundamentally from the hereditary and factional struggles dominating other Italian states. From one mystery to the next, as the lagoon city extended its reach over the plains and rivers of northern Italy, one must ask, could Venice's careful orchestration of power and prosperity endure? Or would the same forces of ambition, war, and intrigue that toppled seigneurial dynasties eventually test the republic's enduring stability? While the political landscape of medieval Italy shifted under the pressures of seigneurial ambitions, papal struggles, and republican expansions, an equally profound transformation unfolded within its cities, workshops, and courts, the awakening of culture and intellect that would lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. Across Florence, Siena, Ferrara, and Verona, a new generation of thinkers, artists, and patrons emerged, driven by both curiosity and ambition, determined to assert their place in a world shaped by turmoil yet rich with opportunity. Scholars like Petrarch turned to the ancient texts of Greece and Rome, dusting off manuscripts long ignored, and in doing so, questioned, analyzed, and reconstructed the intellectual traditions of the past. His humanist approach, blending textual criticism with moral and philosophical inquiry, created networks of learning that extended across courts, universities, and city councils, fostering a culture of debate and discovery. Meanwhile, in the realm of art, visionaries like Giotto began to break away from the stylized conventions of medieval illustration, portraying human emotion, perspective, and spatial realism in ways that made stories come alive not only in churches but in the minds of those who beheld them. The frescoes of the Arena Chapel in Padua, for example, are not merely religious narratives. They are immersive experiences where light, shadow, and human expression draw the viewer into a world both sacred and tangible. Courts of powerful families, Viscanti in Milan, Scaligari in Verona, Este in Ferrara, dead as incubators for this cultural flowering, using art, literature, and architecture as tools of prestige and influence, transforming political authority into visible and enduring cultural power. Monumental constructions, from fortified palaces to cathedral complexes, were not merely displays of wealth or defense. They were statements of identity, blending spiritual significance with technical mastery, while training generations of artisans, engineers, and architects whose skills would define Italian urban spaces for centuries. Even music and literature adapted to these new social realities. Vernacular languages became vehicles for sophisticated, poetic, and philosophical expression, while civic events, pageantry, and courtly performance reinforced both communal identity and dynastic prestige. Yet amid these achievements lay an underlying tension, the same instability, factional violence, and political intrigue that spurred artistic patronage also threatened the continuity of intellectual progress. Some researchers suggest that it was precisely this precarious balance of competition and opportunity that fueled innovation, while others argue that without the protection of strong families and wealthy patrons, many of these advances might have been lost to time. As we leave behind the corridors of learning and the frescoed walls of Padua, we are left with a question that lingers in the shadows. How did the creative sparks ignited in these turbulent centuries manage to illuminate an entire continent? And what forces would either nurture or extinguish this fragile brilliance in the decades to come? Beneath the grand palaces, frescoed walls, and scholarly pursuits of late medieval Italy lay a network of economic innovation that powered not only culture but also political dominance. A system as intricate as the canals of Venice or the winding streets of Florence. The growth of commerce, banking, and trade created wealth that transformed the possibilities of cities, turning them into hubs of influence that reached far beyond the Italian peninsula. Venice, with its sprawling lagoon and maritime expertise, harnessed the seas to dominate trade routes that spanned the Mediterranean, linking the Levant with Europe, carrying spices, silk, and precious metals, while simultaneously nurturing local industries such as shipbuilding, glassmaking, and textile production. Florence, by contrast, became synonymous with banking, where families like the Medici perfected systems of credit, letters of exchange, and international financial networks, allowing capital to flow between courts, markets, and distant trading posts. These systems were not merely economic tools. They became instruments of power, enabling wealthy merchant families to influence political decisions, fund armies, and patronize artists whose works would immortalize their names. In the Po Valley and Adriatic regions, the Este family leveraged fertile lands and river routes to create steady streams of agricultural and commercial revenue, reinforcing both their military and cultural ambitions. While in northern cities like Milan and Verona, seigneurial families coordinated taxation, trade tariffs, and mercenary contracts with an administrative sophistication that rivaled monarchies. The urban marketplaces buzzed with life, filled with the sounds of merchants calling wares, artisans hammering, and the scent of goods from distant lands, creating sensory landscapes that reflected both opportunity and competition. Yet economic growth carried its own tensions: inflation, factional disputes over trade privileges, and the constant threat of war forced these cities and families to innovate continually, blending diplomacy, finance, and military strategy. Scholars suggest that the very volatility of the Italian economy, its rewards and risks, fostered a culture of pragmatism and adaptability that would later underpin Renaissance enterprise and creativity. At the same time, these systems widened gaps between elite and commoner, between city and countryside, and between competing mercantile powers, creating fault lines that could erupt in revolt or intrigue. As we trace the flow of gold, grain, and influence across Italy, we are left to wonder how these economic arteries not only sustained kingdoms of art and intellect, but also created the delicate pressures that would either stabilize or fracture the Italian world in the centuries to come, setting the stage for both extraordinary achievement and profound upheaval. As wealth and political power accumulated in Italian cities, an equally remarkable transformation took place in the realms of culture and intellect, a quiet revolution that would eventually ignite the Renaissance. In Florence, Venice, and Ferrara, courts and city governments alike became patrons of art, literature, and learning, understanding that cultural prestige was inseparable from political influence. Imagine the hushed corridors of libraries lined with manuscripts, the scent of ink and parchment filling the air as scholars labored to copy, illuminate, and preserve texts from antiquity, works that had once seemed lost to time. Petrarch moved through such spaces, collecting classical works, corresponding with poets, princes, and thinkers across Europe, and contemplating human nature with a meticulous eye, laying the groundwork for humanism, a philosophy that would reframe how individuals understood themselves and the world. Meanwhile, Dante wandered the political and factional streets of Florence, composing the Divine Comedy, a vision of the cosmos that intertwined the spiritual and temporal, the personal and political, in ways that few had dared. Artists like Giotto transformed religious narrative into human experience, painting faces etched with emotion, figures caught in motion, spaces infused with perspective and depth, creating frescoes that felt alive, almost breathing, as if the sacred stories themselves could step from the walls. In courts like those of the Este and Scaligari, elaborate patronage programs funded not only architecture and sculpture, but also music, drama, and scientific inquiry, fostering environments where innovation could flourish. The cultural awakening was not confined to elites. Cities became arenas where guilds, scholars, and civic institutions participated in intellectual exchange, debates, and performances, bridging the worlds of commerce, politics, and art. This interplay of wealth, competition, and curiosity created a feedback loop. Successful patronage attracted the finest talents, whose works in turn enhanced the prestige and authority of their sponsors. Yet this flowering of creativity coexisted with political fragility, factional rivalry, and occasional violence, so that the beauty of a city's churches, palaces, or illuminated texts often masked the tensions simmering beneath cobbled streets. Some researchers suggest that this very tension, the pressure of wealth, ambition, and instability served as a crucible for innovation, pushing artists, writers, and thinkers to explore new techniques, ideas, and forms of expression, from one masterpiece to the next. From library to palace, Italy was transforming, and as the 14th century drew toward its close, the seeds sown by scholars, poets, and painters were quietly preparing the soil for an explosion of creativity that would leave the world forever changed. But the question lingers: could such cultural brilliance survive the storms of politics, war, and human ambition that continually roiled the peninsula? The streets of medieval Italian cities were living canvases, where stone and mortar told stories as vividly as any manuscript or fresco. From Florence to Milan, Siena to Venice, urban landscapes were being reshaped in ways that reflected both the ambitions of rulers and the ingenuity of artisans. Massive cathedrals rose, their skeletal frameworks of arches and flying buttresses piercing the sky, while vaults and domes soared above public squares, capturing light in ways that made stone appear almost ethereal. The construction of these monumental structures was not merely an exercise in aesthetics. It was a declaration of civic pride, a demonstration of wealth, and a tool for asserting political authority over rival cities and factions. In Florence, the cathedral's dome, envisioned by Brunelleschi, represented a technical and architectural revolution, employing ingenious machinery and mathematical precision to achieve a scale and elegance that had never been seen before. Workshops buzzed with the clanging of chisels, the scent of wet lime mortar, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers, as master masons trained apprentices who would carry these skills across generations. Yet, architecture was not limited to sacred spaces. Palaces, fortifications, and public buildings transformed the urban experience, with fortified walls, towers, and gates asserting the power of families like the Viscanti in Milan, the Este in Ferrara, and the Scaligari in Verona. Streets were organized into deliberate patterns, Piazzas opened into gathering spaces, and bridges spanned rivers, creating urban networks that facilitated trade, communication, and military movement. Some historians suggest that this architectural flourishing was driven not only by practical needs, but also by a desire to craft a visual language of authority and identity, where every building spoke to the ambitions, values, and sophistication of those who commissioned it. Artistic and technical innovations intertwined. Frescoes adorned walls, sculptures punctuated entrances, and delicate stone tracery and decorative motifs elevated structural functionality into visual poetry. But even as cities reached new heights of beauty and technical mastery, the pressure of political instability and factional rivalry hung in the air. Towers and fortresses were as necessary as palaces and cathedrals, reminders that behind the elegant facades, survival and dominance were constant concerns. The textures of marble, the shadows cast by soaring arches, the echoes of hammers on stone, all combined to create urban environments that were at once awe-inspiring and precarious. And as we step back and imagine walking these streets in the twilight, with torchlight flickering across stone walls, one must wonder, could the city's grandeur and ambition withstand the relentless currents of power, intrigue, and human desire that surged through medieval Italy? Step into the grand halls of Italy's medieval courts, where the murmur of courtiers, the flicker of candlelight on gilded walls, and the distant clatter of armored footsteps set the stage for a cultural awakening unlike anything Europe had yet seen. Here, in palaces both modest and vast, powerful families transformed their political ambitions into engines of artistic and intellectual production, commissioning works that would endure for centuries. The Viscanti of Milan, the Scaligari of Verona, and the Este were more than rulers. They were patrons who understood that art, architecture, and literature could serve as extensions of their authority, creating legacies that outlived fleeting military victories. In Ferrara, the Este court's libraries and scriptoria became sanctuaries of knowledge, where illuminated manuscripts were painstakingly copied, classical texts preserved, and new works in vernacular Italian took shape. Poets, scholars, and philosophers flocked to these courts, their voices shaping conversations about morality, governance, and the nature of human experience. Venice, though a republic, engaged in a parallel pursuit, blending mercantile prosperity with cultural investment, funding public works, civic art, and architectural innovation that celebrated both communal identity and political dominance. The patronage of these courts fostered experimentation, allowing artists like Giotto to revolutionize painting with depth, emotion, and realism previously unseen, and writers like Dante to wield the vernacular language with philosophical and poetic precision. Music, theater, and civic pageantry added layers to this rich cultural tapestry, filling palaces and piazzas with the sounds of human creativity. Scholars have suggested that this deliberate cultivation of intellectual and artistic life was not merely ornamental. It functioned as a political strategy, subtly reinforcing social hierarchies while projecting stability, sophistication, and divine favor. Yet beneath the surface of lavish banquets and dazzling ceremonies, tensions simmered. Factional rivalries, economic pressures, and threats from rival states constantly challenged the court's authority, making cultural production both a display of power and a shield against uncertainty. The textures of embroidered tapestries, the scents of exotic inks and oils, and the rhythms of skilled artisans at work all contributed to an environment where aesthetic and political ambition intertwined seamlessly. And as we linger in the echoing corridors of these courts, watching candlelight dance on frescoed ceilings and imagining debates on law, philosophy, and poetry, one must ask, could the brilliance of Italian cultural life endure when every masterpiece was shadowed by intrigue, ambition, and the ever-present threat of conflict? Now, let us drift from the glittering courts to the bustling streets and canals, where the lifeblood of Italy's economic transformation flowed, a world of merchants, bankers, and trade that reshaped the very fabric of medieval society. Imagine the clatter of coins, the creak of ships' timbers, and the cries of porters unloading goods from far-off lands, spices, silks, and precious metals that connected Italy to the entire Mediterranean and beyond. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became nerve centers of commerce, their prosperity rooted in sophisticated banking systems, international trade networks, and industrial production that created wealth on a scale previously unimaginable. The Medici in Florence exemplified the fusion of economic ingenuity and political influence. Their banking enterprises allowed them to support massive artistic commissions, fund diplomatic missions, and subtly manipulate civic governance, all while accumulating immense personal power. Venice, while a republic, leveraged its maritime dominance and control over trade routes to generate revenues that could finance military campaigns, civic infrastructure, and the patronage of art, blending commercial acumen with political authority. Merchants in these cities were not merely traders. They were innovators, negotiating complex contracts, establishing partnerships across borders, and navigating shifting alliances with the same precision as any diplomat or general. Some researchers suggest that this concentration of financial power enabled cities to weather political instability, funding armies or defenses when feudal lords or external threats loomed. Others propose that the very wealth these networks created accelerated social stratification, turning prosperous merchant families into a new elite whose influence rivaled that of traditional nobility. The physical evidence of this economic revolution is everywhere. The tall palazzi lining Florence's streets, the fortified warehouses along Venetian canals, the meticulously organized market squares humming with activity, all whispering stories of ambition, risk, and calculation. The smell of ink on contracts, the rustle of ledgers, the clinking of scales as merchants weighed coins, created an almost tangible atmosphere of commerce that intertwined with the intellectual and artistic life of these cities. And as Italy's mercantile and banking networks grew, they did more than enrich the few. They laid the foundation for cultural projects, political experiments, and technological innovations that would ripple through the Renaissance. Yet with every gain came vulnerability, for wealth attracted envy, provoked factional strife, and drew foreign interest. Could these economic engines survive the pressures of power, intrigue, and competition, or would the fortunes they generated become both a blessing and a curse? The answer would shape Italy's destiny in ways few could yet imagine, as the wealth of cities like Florence, Venice, and Ferrara poured into the streets. Palaces and libraries, it nourished something intangible yet profound, the awakening of intellect, creativity, and artistic ambition that would come to define Italy's place in history. Picture the quiet rustle of manuscripts being unrolled in candlelit studies, the scent of parchment and ink hanging in the air as scholars meticulously copied classical texts or debated the nature of humanity and the cosmos. Universities and courts became centers not just of political maneuvering, but of intellectual exploration, where questions once considered heretical or dangerous were now approached with curiosity and rigorous thought. Petrarch, wandering through these bustling streets and tranquil libraries, collected and examined ancient texts, searching for wisdom that had survived centuries, bridging the world of antiquity with contemporary concerns. Others, like Dante, wove the political tensions, religious complexities, and human emotions of their time into epic narratives, crafting works in the vernacular that transformed how stories could be told and understood, allowing a broader audience to engage with profound ideas. Art, too, mirrored this awakening. Giotto's frescoes, bursting with color, emotion, and spatial depth, turned walls into living stages where saints, patrons, and citizens alike were depicted with a realism and humanity previously unseen. In cities where merchants and seigneurial families competed for prestige, artistic patronage became a silent battlefield. Murals, palaces, and tombs carefully constructed to demonstrate wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. Some historians suggest that this environment of competition accelerated innovation, pushing artists, architects, and scholars to explore techniques and ideas beyond conventional boundaries, while others argue that it merely reflected existing social hierarchies and ambitions. Meanwhile, libraries and scriptoriums preserved not only the classical past, but also fostered new writings in philosophy, science, and theology, establishing a foundation for critical inquiry that would define the Renaissance. The sensory world of this period was rich. The gleam of newly polished marble, the sharp Thames of fresh paint, the echo of lectures and debates across stone halls, the hushed awe in churches adorned with intricate stained glass, all reinforcing a sense that Italy was becoming a crucible of culture and intellect. Yet, beneath the beauty and learning, tension lingered between tradition and innovation, church authority and secular exploration, wealth and inequality. Could this awakening survive the storms of politics, warfare, and ecclesiastical control? Or would these brilliant sparks fade under the weight of human ambition and conflict? The answer, as we shall see, would be written not only in books and paintings, but across the very streets and courts of medieval Italy. As we approach the final chapter of medieval Italy, it is impossible not to feel the lingering echoes of centuries shaped by power struggles, urban ingenuity, and cultural ambition. Imagine the sprawling network of city streets, canals, and fortified walls, where every stone seems to whisper the stories of the families, communes, and popes who once held sway over the land. The legacies of the Viscanti in Milan, the Scaligari in Verona, the Este in Ferrara, and the mercantile might of Venice converged to create a political mosaic both fragmented and vibrant, a land of competing authorities yet intertwined destinies. This political fragmentation, though often a source of conflict, fostered an environment where innovation, artistic experimentation, and intellectual exploration could flourish, for no single power dominated the cultural or economic life of the peninsula entirely. In Florence, wealth amassed through banking and trade allowed families like the Medici to become patrons of unprecedented influence, supporting artists, architects, and thinkers whose works would shape the very concept of beauty and knowledge in Europe. Across the Veneto, Venice leveraged maritime supremacy to secure territories, integrating commercial acumen with strategic governance that preserved autonomy while projecting power across the Adriatic. The sensory richness of this Italy is almost overwhelming. The glint of sunlight on canal waters, the scent of ink and fresh paint in workshops, the hum of commerce in piazza, the solemn resonance of bells calling citizens to prayer or assembly. Meanwhile, intellectual and artistic achievements intertwined, each informing the other. Dante and Petrarch, laying the literary groundwork for humanist thought, Giotto revolutionizing visual representation, and scholars systematically preserving and critiquing classical knowledge. The lessons of governance, however, were equally profound. The rise and consolidation of seigneurial states demonstrated the delicate balance between authority, legitimacy, and administration, showing how families could wield power without provoking popular revolt, how military might and financial acumen shaped politics as much as rhetoric or law. Yet, for all this accomplishment, the shadow of human ambition and conflict never fully lifted. Wars, factional disputes, papal struggles, and economic competition remained constant, reminding observers that creativity and violence often coexist, shaping the trajectory of society in ways that are both inspiring and terrifying. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, Italy stood poised on the edge of a new era, the Renaissance, a period in which the seeds sown by centuries of medieval development would burst forth in a flowering of art, thought, and science that would transform not only the peninsula but all of Europe. And so, as you drift into the echoes of history tonight, let the streets, the palaces, and the scholars of medieval Italy linger in your mind. A reminder that from conflict, ambition, and curiosity arises the brilliance that shapes civilizations and defines the course of human achievement.